Thank you so much for being here. So to start off, we're gonna just start our panel with a quick icebreaker. So our question is, what is one word that comes to mind when you think about Africa? So we'll give you a few seconds to think really quickly what first comes to mind when you think about Africa. Yeah.
Just shout them out. Continent? Complex. Multiple. For those who are just joining us, we're starting with an icebreaker, asking you to let us know what the first word that comes to your mind is when you think of Africa. Home. Anything else?
Just one word? I always think of black continent.
Black continent.
My wife and
Disconnection. Diverse. Creative. So next we're each going to sort of introduce ourselves and the programs that we participated in and talk a little bit about what we were thinking about Africa before we went there and how that... I'm sorry. We're going to introduce ourselves and the programs that we each went on, and we're going to talk about what we sort of thought of Africa before we went there and how that perception changed through our experience of living and learning there.
Hi again, I'm Amber. My program was SIT Cameroon. I studied social development and social change through different areas, different regions throughout Cameroon. So my program was very immersive. I wasn't just in one university, but I got to travel to Kribi, Batoufam, and all around Yaoundé. And then we went to France for a week to study Cameroonian diaspora. So my program focused a lot about immersing myself into this culture, this Cameroonian culture. My words are immersive, eye-opening, inspiring, and challenging. I picked these words because throughout my semester there, I was immersed in so many different cultures. I was astounded with the number of people I've met, with the stories I heard, and just how that translated back to my time here at Denison and just what I wanted to see when I got there. So to tell you a little bit more about why I chose Cameroon, I was studying French at with Madame Mokam over here, and I was looking for an experience that would continue my Africanist study that I began at Denison and continue that language. So through my research, I learned Cameroon was described as Africa in miniature. And once I got there, I was just completely blown away by the beauty of it, by the complexities, as you see, the complexity of it, and just the openness. So one of the, I think for challenging, I want to touch on that a little bit more than the rest. One of the challenges for me was kind of unlearning what I've learned about Africa here at Denison. I started my Africa studies with South Africa my freshman year, and I learned a lot about the apartheid, and I learned a lot about tribalism, and I learned a lot about the differences in languages and tribes, and just even under one country, there's so many diversity. So throughout my time here, it continued that sort of secondary sources, secondary learning. And once I got to Cameroon, I got that primary sources, that primary learning. And it was challenging because I felt like I understood, but I really didn't. And it was kind of it was challenging to like take away that those perceptions I had already about Africa, and make sure I'm not romanticizing it based on my readings, and romanticizing this idea of the African continent, but looking at the realities as well. So that was challenging for me. And I don't know if I can touch on more, but very inspiring, eye-opening. Cameroon really inspired me to learn more about myself once I got back to Denison, and just explore more about what I want to do in life, what I want to do after Denison, and how I want to take my experiences there to other communities in a broader, broaden my understanding of how I can help. Cameroon inspired me to just continue to learn about Africa and continue to learn about the continent and all its people and all its diverse languages and cultures. So I'm very, very happy I went. Yeah.
So I'm Joanna. I studied at the University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa, which was sort of a more generalized program through Arcadia, where once we got to the university, we got to sort of select whatever classes we wanted to take. I'm a communication student here, so I took a lot of classes sort of in that area. I was really interested in the history of South Africa because I think that that's a country that is taught a lot in American schools, you know, Nelson Mandela and the story of apartheid and things like that. It was also a safer option for me because I don't speak another language, so all of the courses were in English, which is sort of the colonial legacy in South Africa. That's not to say that there was no language exposure there, since South Africa has 12 national languages, but it was a little bit easier for me in that capacity. I think one of the best things that I was able to learn when I was at University of Cape Town, since I was taking classes in the sort of same area that I take here, was the way that academics in the United States and academics elsewhere follow all of the same sort of topics, but under a totally different paradigm. I think the political and economic paradigm of being in a country in the global south, the history of imperialism, the history of colonialism was really eye-opening, and I use the word liberating to see. It really changed the way that I'm able to conceptualize particularly media, and as Amber mentioned, sort of the portrayal of Africa in Western media, either as sort of the hopeless continent or like Africa Rising, this neo-colonial idea of Africa as a place for other people to sink their money into. And I think being present in South Africa and being taught by indigenous South Africans and hearing their sort of firsthand experience with how this label affects them as Africans in their daily life was really gave me a new understanding of like the purpose of media in a global context. I was also really impressed with sort of the communal brotherhood, sisterhood aspect of the African culture, which particularly I only saw in South Africa, which is something that I don't think I would have noticed as much in the sort of competitive American environment where not everyone is someone that can be as close to you as that. So I really took that to heart and have hoped to bring that back to Denison. I would say another word that I used is isolating, because I think that having this experience and having a sort of new framework to look at the rest of the world in makes you stand out a little bit in your understanding of things when you come back to classes, and it can be a little bit isolating having this new perspective, but it's something that I wouldn't have traded for anything. Yeah, so that was my experience in South Africa.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm Dasni. I went to Rwanda through SIT, and the program was called Post-Genocide Restoration and Peace Building. And so even just with that program title, you can tell, like, even the content was pretty heavy. We learned about the genocide, and that's not something that was new to me, but kind of like what you were saying, is like being in that country and learning about it is something very different and very specific, and like learning about it from people who lived it is something very like unique. So I think like that aspect of the program was what was the most like, I think I used the word, oh I didn't, the most transformational for me, because that was I just think that like being there in Rwanda gave me like an experience that I wouldn't have been able to have anywhere else, and that I like really learned, like academically advanced myself a lot in terms of like how to deal with post-conflict societies, because I was in one, and I think like the biggest challenge that came with that was that it was like emotionally taxing, and it did require a very like very high level of maturity to be able to kind of deal with all those circumstances, but also to be like in a culture where that is their reality every day, and to understand that like me being there for 3 months doesn't give me like the claim to that, to their experience. It just gives me a very small understanding of it, and to have to like I was in a homestay. That was like one of the requirements through SIT. So like to live with a family who were survivors, and to kind of have that experience was just, it was very interesting, because it's like they took me as like a part of their family, but I was also like, you know, not there during the genocide. So it's a very interesting balance to have to kind of go through. But other than that, I also think that like no matter how much I tried to unlearn what I had learned about Africa at Denison, that unlearning process, kind of like you said, Amber and Joanne too, I think that like it really like started when I went there, because like no matter how much I tried, it's like it just wasn't what I expected it to be, and it was incredible, and I had an amazing time, but it's not something that I ever would have imagined it to be before I actually went there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Calvin Montgomery, and I also studied in Cape Town last semester in South Africa. And part of the reason why I chose Cape Town was actually because my best friend growing up, his dad was from Cape Town. So he emigrated to the U.S. When he was 17 from Johannesburg. So kind of throughout my whole life, I'd been exposed a little bit to South Africa's history. And that kind of kept into the back of my mind when I was choosing study abroad locations. But past that, I'm a history student here at Denison, and I think learning about South Africa's history a little bit in courses here kind of piqued my interest in terms of both the colonial history and then also the apartheid history that people mentioned. And so looking at it as location, you know, from the U.S., there's not a lot of media narratives that come out of South Africa that kind of we experience. For the most part, it was either regarding violence or the drought that was happening right before I went to South Africa. So that was kind of a concern of family members and, you know, people around you when you said, "Oh, I'm going to go to South Africa." That's their point of concern, which I think is definitely one of kind of the main points with this myths and realities topic that we're going on, is that, you know, sometimes the most important narratives don't exactly shine through with a lot of countries in Africa. But I think going there totally changes that narrative. And I mean, even if you do significant research, you'd find out that those really aren't the most permeant topics in a country like South Africa. But in terms of my experience there, I really, really enjoyed it. I think one of the really interesting parts for me as a history student was to be able to kind of participate in their history a little bit more in terms of the apartheid. You know, coming from the United States, it's not like I can talk with people who experienced the revolution in the United States in 1776. But in South Africa, I had a chance to interview and work with people who were part of the apartheid movement, and that was a huge part of their lifetime and something that so many people sacrificed so much for. And so being able to interact with people who were so central to their history was really, really interesting. And then outside of that, I think studying at UCT, University of Cape Town, which all three of us studied at through this Arcadia program, was very interesting as well. I think in comparison to Denison, it was nice to experience a large university. Denison's, you know, a couple thousand, and UCT's over 20,000, so equivalent to like a large state school in the U.S. And so participating in some of the larger lectures and even group work with, you know, kids from all over the world was really interesting for me, and I think it's something that I'll definitely take away with me, you know, after Denison. And then kind of most specifically within that student culture, one of the words I mentioned on there is inspirational. I think one of the biggest culture differences I noticed was within the student culture. I think within UCT, and from what I was able to understand more within Africa, the kind of activist culture within students was much stronger there. I think in general, there were plenty of issues that these students were passionate about, and they completely stood their ground, formulated a plan, and took back what they thought was theirs or what they thought was just, which I think is something that we as students can take away from and, you know, bring forward with us politically, you know, academically, in all areas of life. So I think that was something that I really took away and something I thought was really inspirational.
Hi guys, my name's Jane. I also studied in University of Cape Town in South Africa. Joe and I went at the same time, and I think we had a lot of similar experiences, but also different as well. I'm a psychology major, and I take, you know, a lot of science classes here at Denison. And when I went to University of Cape Town, I only took one psychology class, and then the rest were, you know, very different, like history and culture and classes like that. You know, the psychology class I took there was pretty similar and to something I would take here. So I'm really glad that I took, you know, different classes. The other classes ended up being like my favorite classes that I took, and I took a community and youth development class, which I think is one of my favorite classes I've taken, you know, in my whole college time here or there, because it really talked about people, like kind of what Calvin mentioned, people our age and kind of the differences that they're experiencing in South Africa. Yeah, so that's what I kind of wrote. My word of thought-provoking is there was a lot of learning outside of the classroom too that I haven't, at least in like a lot of my science classes and stuff, that I haven't you know, seen as much in Denison. We had a lot of work to do kind of outside the classroom and learning from the individual people, the locals in South Africa, which I thought was really valuable and kind of helped bring what we were learning within the classroom to you know, the culture and the country as a whole. So that was definitely something that I try to think about when I'm coming back here, is there's more to just, you know, learning in the classroom, and kind of think about how it relates to, you know, a broader whole or community. I definitely, before I went, you know, as some people have said, some family members or people were a little bit concerned. about why, or me going to South Africa, they're really only saw what the news told them, and that was a lot of maybe negativity about violence, or like Calvin said, the drought in Cape Town. But I kind of looked at it as one, I don't think Denison would send us somewhere that would be unsafe, and two, like, there is violence and negativity, in all places of the world. There's violence here, and there's issues, throughout the world. So I always tried to think of that when I was making my final decision of where to go abroad. And yeah, so I try to keep reminding family members and people about that. And I guess lastly, I just really, I felt the people, everyone in South Africa was very welcoming, which was very like comforting to me. I didn't have any like negativity like surrounding everyone in my classes. The people, they wanted to like help us understand and learn, and I don't know, I think that was really great. And I think there's a lot to bring back from my time there to Denison and my classes now. So, yeah.
It does? Okay. Yeah, so now, I mean, it's kind of this is meant to be more of a discussion type panel where we welcome any reflections on the icebreaker that we had, or any questions or thoughts you had based on any of our responses.
I just asked a question. Did only one of you live with a family?
I did.
So he asked if it was just one person that lived with a family.
So I also was part of a homestay. So I lived with three families, and then I lived in an apartment as well. But my main family, it was my mama, my grandmother, and a sister and a brother. And then that was in Yaoundé. And then in Batu Farm, which just want to go back. But in Batu Farm, I was part of a polygamous family. So it was my dad, and then it was his wives, and then his children. And I was with them for a week only, and in that week I learned more French than I ever had in my life, because they only spoke French, and the little kids were just everywhere. But yeah, I live with the families, and I think SIT does a really good job of homestays. It's very, very crucial for us.
So the way my program at SIT worked was so if we say that it was approximately 3-month program, for 2 out of those 3 months we lived with a homestay, and for the last month we lived on our own. So I lived in a house with 4 other people on my program, and so for the homestay I had a mom and a dad, and I had a lot of siblings in between. There was a 19-year-old brother, and I had 3 siblings, 2 younger brothers and a younger sister who were all in boarding school. And then the youngest was at home, and he was 3. So he's probably the one that I made the closest relationship with, because he was always at home. And yeah, I think, and I actually got lucky, because in my family, my host mom spoke French, and my dad spoke English really well, because he worked at the British High Commission. So I didn't practice my Kinyarwanda a whole lot, but it was good, because I had really good conversations with them. Does anyone else have questions?
So I was late to the panel, and forgive me if this question is kind of redundant if I missed this, but I'm interested to hear, for anyone that wants to answer, what your experiences were what your connections were with the continent beforehand, and what you would say was the biggest connection you've gained afterwards, and kind of how that perspective changed.
Or does anyone?
So the first part, what our experiences was beforehand.
Like what connected you, what drew you to the continent, and like what kind of is your main takeaway from it now?
Yeah.
The same thing.
Yeah. So what drew me to Africa was my intro to South Africa class. That was my first real interaction with anything that has to do with Africa in general. As I think someone mentioned here, I think Joe mentioned, in high school and middle school, all we learn is U.S. history and like European history. And even when we learn world history, it's still very Western centered kind of learning. So that was my first, and then from there I kind of went down a spiral and took every single African course I could here at Denison, except one, which I'm still kind of about. But that was my connection and what drew me to the continent. And then what I took away now is I have a deeper respect for the continent as a whole, for Cameroon as a country, and because I had done my research beforehand, I had a perception of Cameroon due to some conflicts that they were having, and now I can honestly say like that completely shifted, and I have a deep respect for the people there and for the lessons that they taught me. So that answer?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I think one thing that I thought a lot about when I was deciding where to go, I mean, I never considered really anywhere besides Cape Town because I'd always wanted to travel there, but like as a white student studying abroad in Africa, we really had to think about sort of like the space that we were taking up, as like our program, Arcadia, was like all U.S. international students, and it was almost entirely white students who had the means to study abroad, and sort of what that meant for us, and what it could have meant for like if a Black American student had the access to go to Africa. But that being said, I felt sort of like when I was choosing going abroad that I couldn't like, I felt like I needed to choose somewhere that was going to give me a new perspective, and I felt that there was no place but Africa that could do that for me.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, kind of going on along the same lines. I think one of the influencing factors that I think Joe mentioned was kind of like the lack of knowledge and the lack of connection with the continent for me. I think part of like the reason a lot of kids do study abroad is to put themselves in a situation they're uncomfortable with and really explore something new. So I think I had a cursory knowledge of what I was getting into, but part of the adventure was kind of going in with a little bit less knowledge than maybe some other kids were, you know, if they were more familiar with the country they were traveling to. But I think ultimately that puts you in the best position you can be, because I think you're more likely to experiment, and at the same time, you know, you really grasp onto that culture even more, because all you're soaking in is knowledge, and you're coming in with kind of little preconceived notions as to, like, you know, your opinion of the people there or the culture there and things like that. And I think coming away from my experience, my biggest takeaway was not that I had a negative perception at all of the people there going in, but I was so blown away by just the positivity of the people in South Africa. And then I also traveled to Namibia for a little while as well. And I think just the culture of inclusivity and, you know, just general, you know, social positivity. I mean, I'm from the Midwest, and I think in general people from the Midwest are pretty nice, but this was far and above that, and I think that was my biggest piece that I came away from. Just great people.
Yeah, I think I can pretty much echo most of that as well. I think for me, like, the biggest thing, like I kind of touched on it earlier, was like meeting people who had lived through the genocide, either as like victims or whose like family members were victims or whose family members were perpetrators, which is a completely different experience as well. And it just gave me this huge, like, I think kind of like someone else said, like this huge respect for the people who are there. And more than that, for the people who who are like currently in Rwanda and like living with that reality, and kind of like they've come so far from that now, like 25 years later. And I think that that's like just a crazy example of how much like human beings can like forgive and can like coexist and can be like together and can like come up from things that happen, and like that resilience was something that I really really appreciated. Yeah.
Push you just a little bit on that.
Sure.
I'm trying to figure out the intensity of that conversation. What I'm asking is this: are people still talking about the issue in the way? Oh, you hear me, don't you?
I think for the camera.
Oh.
For the camera.
Yeah. I'll break the camera, and I speak loud. So, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is whether 25 years later you can still hear the intensity of the conversation. Is it like, it's not like today here in this country where the constant conversation is Trump, right? And how horrible he is.
Right.
Now, are people then still talking about this? I mean, one of the things I want to discuss with you because you knew that you would have historical interest in it? Or is it because that's what they talk about still? They're still living, not just in the image of it, but in sort of the reality of it.
Did you want to add something to that, or do you? Yeah, go ahead, and I can just answer all together.
Pardon?
She wants to ask something as a follow-up,
Okay.
so I can just answer all together.
I don't want to take command of the conversation.
Adding on to that question, I guess, like, what are the taboos that surround the Rwandan genocide, and like how have the communities been able to come together, just like as a community or even just like as individuals post genocide?
Yeah, so I guess as an answer to all of that, one of the first and like biggest things that I learned there was that they, as their first kind of reconciliation strategy, they eliminated the use of their ethnic groups. So those are like the two main ones are Hutu and Tutsi, and that's how the genocide started. And we learned that, like, the first thing we learned is basically how those ethnicities were constructed, how those differences were used by Belgian colonizers in order to pin these two groups together, and how, like, they speak the same language, they have the same culture, they don't actually have, like, distinct physical differences. Those were just, like, kind of brought on by these colonizers in order to use that kind of like divide and conquer type technique that we see way too much. And so one of their first strategies was to eliminate the use of those and to not. So now, like, if you talk to a Rwandan person, they'll probably tell you that they are a survivor and not use the their ethnic group as an identifier anymore. Although, like, obviously they do know within themselves, within the communities, who belongs to which family and such. And so I think, like, more than anything is that they don't necessarily talk about it all the time or, like, constantly bring it up. But I think that it's something that, like, no matter what they do is a part of their lives, especially for survivors who are sometimes, like, consistently asked about their experiences and who sometimes feel the obligation to talk about their experiences now, and to there's this, like, kind of obligation also to, like, educate the youth and, like, let them know what happened. And so it's very much, like, ingrained in their culture and in their identities, but I wouldn't say that it is something that they necessarily, like, bring up all the time. But it's just kind of, like, ingrained. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add on to that a little bit with, you know, the apartheid is, I learned a lot about, like, in my classes, the education system and the healthcare that is in Cape Town and South Africa. It's still something that, like, yes, the apartheid is, like, over, but they're still living that. the education system for so many people. I mean, I don't remember the exact number, but the dropout rate before graduating high school is huge. The access to healthcare is so limited for so many people. That's why, you know, HIV rates are so high there. So yeah, I would say, you know, people are trying to make progress, but it's still something that's very prevalent, and so many people are still living.
Hi. Okay, just adding on to that. I think a lot of the countries that you guys went to are like not to say like the basic ones that most people go to, but the ones that most people end up going to. But Africa has like it has 50 countries that all are, I think, amazing and most people should go to. So after your study abroad experience, how do you think that you as like an individual or like someone who's listening to you can begin to change your perspective about Africa? Big question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Does someone else?
I'm trying to think. I mean, yeah, I think like the understanding that like each of our experiences is individual and unique and not even scratching the surface of like what there is to be offered by Africa as a continent. I think like just understanding the limitations of our experience, and also like we were able to travel, most of us I think, into other countries while we were there, but and I think even just moving from one space to another and seeing like the regional differences there, like that was really important in understanding sort of the nuance from country to country, and how even those are like colonially imparted ideas, the idea of nation borders, and like how all of it can be deconstructed, and like just understanding that I think is really important.
Just briefly, that kind of reminded me of when Joe and I first, you know, we were actually in the airport when we first got there. We talk about this a lot. There was this girl walking behind us, and she kind of goes, "Oh my gosh, like we're in Africa." And like, yeah, we are in Africa, but we are also in like South Africa, and South Africa is its own unique country. And I think even over the past couple of weeks, hearing two different countries that, you know, their experiences, and it is so different, and each, it's really important to remember, you know, like you said, there are like 50 whatever countries in Africa, and they're all unique and have their own culture and history and things like that.
Yeah. I had a really similar experience, or like for me coming back to the US and like seeing all my friends again. All of my friends came up to me and were like, "Oh my God, how was Africa?" I was like, first of all, I have no idea what the entire African continent is like. Like, I went to Rwanda. You don't ask people how was Europe or like how was South America, right? Like, you ask them what the country. So I think like language is a really important like part of what we like when we come back, and we're very careful about the language that we do use. Like, I like in terms of like the African continent, or like using the country, or like even talking about the genocide. Like, there's still a lot of people who call it a war or like a civil war, which is something that people are trying to fight. So like, I think like, yeah, I would just say like language and the way we speak about our experiences is like not romanticizing it, but also not, you know, not like propagating stereotypes that already exist.
Just to add something briefly to that, I think like coming back from living in Africa for a short time, I think it presents like a really unique opportunity for educating people, because I think in comparison to other continents, people's base of knowledge on Africa is really low. And so everyone's kind of a blank slate as to, you know, using the right wordage in terms of how you classify things. So people pretty much believe whatever you tell them. So I think it's a great opportunity to educate those around you, and, you know, make sure that they understand properly, you know, what these countries are like, and, you know, what their benefits and downsides are, and, you know, hopefully, you know, giving them something to go off so they can spread it to other people as well.
So do you think that's particularly true of the United States? I mean, Europeans are better educated, I think, than Africa. French, I mean, I spent a lot of time in France. Other countries seem to know
Oui, oui. C'est bon, c'est bon. Monsieur, je pense que see, no, actually, I'm gonna change to English or Spanish. I don't know. But I want to answer that. I think that's also a stereotype we hold a lot, just because we see how imperialism worked, how colonialism is still working, and we think that Europeans know like Africa, but they know the Africa that they shaped. And the image that they themselves kind of projected onto it. I don't think that we can say that France itself knows Cameroon, because the Cameroon I know is not the Cameroon France knows, and is seen very, very differently depending on where you go. So I think, yeah, we know Africa, but even that cannot be said entirely. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think adding on to that, if you just watch news in America, you realize that like the countries that are portrayed, let's say the Middle East or South America, it's countries or regions that America does have like business or like economic relationship with, and America never really colonized Africa per se, but France, for example, or even China at this stage, yeah, they do have a perspective of Africa, but it's not really to look at the communities in Africa, but rather like the business that they want to. So I definitely agree with you. I think that like every single, well, most imperial countries just have their own perspective based on the aspect of Africa that they want to capitalize or take advantage on.
Can you speak to popular culture, music, books that you read, dances that you learned?
So I can't really name any of the dances because my professor, he would write and he wouldn't write. So he would say, this is a dance that women use to entice men, and then he would show us the dance but not tell us the name. But there were a lot of dances that we would do in the classroom, but we couldn't like dance outside and do that because just of the way the history of that dances and the way we as American would be perceived doing that dance. And then I read this book. I forgot the name of the book. Maybe you know it. It's about polygamy. And so it was a book about polygamy, but it was from the perspectives of the wives, which made it really, really interesting to like go through before I went and stay with the family, because the book gave me like an insight kind of into like the mindset. But then when I got there, I was like, this book should not be read. So that was my understanding of it. But popular culture, from what I experienced, me and my group, we ended up going to this chicken place mostly every weekend, and it was called J.C. Bastos, and it was like a dance floor on top, and then like a bar area and like eating area in the bottom. So we saw a lot of people there constantly, and that was like the place to go to get the best food. I still think about it. But yeah, that was Cameroon.
That reminds me, KFC was really big in South Africa, but it was like once you get KFC in South Africa, KFC in America is not going to be as good because they actually know how to like season it here. So it was an American thing, but it was their own spin on it. I never went though. I don't like really eat chicken. But anyways, one thing that I think of, so I'm also a cinema major. So there was this small independent theater that I would always go to in Cape Town, and there was one like independent like South African film that was produced, and the film industry there is like really, really small. They rely almost entirely on like Western imports of like big movies. I saw A Star Is Born there, really good movie. But this one was entirely in Afrikaans, and it was about like an Afrikaans soldier during like the wartime in the 1980s when the Afrikaans army was like essentially invading all of the townships to like beat back protesters. And it was like a musical story of like a gay soldier and like his coming out story. So it was really progressive in that sense, but the entire story ignored the underpinnings of like the like racial difference that was occurring in South Africa. So it was really interesting to see how that was the media that they found to be pertinent to make right now, you know? Yeah.
I think one of my favorite parts of the popular culture there was the music scene. I think while I was in South Africa, I really took advantage of that, went to a couple music festivals, and then one of my favorite almost like weekly rituals I would have with my friends is there's this botanical garden right at the base of Table Mountain, which kind of frames the city of Cape Town. So they would have concerts every weekend in the botanical garden with entirely new genres pretty much every weekend. And so there are a number of artists that I still listen to music from and downloaded music from while I was there, and that was definitely one of my fondest memories.
I think music was also a really big thing for me while I was abroad. Kigali, which is like the capital, is where I was, of Rwanda, has a very big like nightlife scene. So like things didn't start until about 10 p.m. and ended at about like 5 a.m. And yeah, I honestly wish. I think it's a much safer culture that in that aspect because people don't binge drink as much in my experience. So it was really nice to just be able to like be out, and I think it comes back to like the aspect of safety. Like before I left, my mom was like, "You can't leave your homestay ever," by the way. But obviously I did do that, and it was just like I honestly felt more safe than I would feel like roaming around the streets in the U.S. at 3 a.m. because I don't know, I didn't feel, because there are so many people out on the streets, like, and I also went to a concert that was really awesome, and yeah, pretty much. Cool.
I'm curious about the unlearning process. How did it go? How was it from your arrival, to the time where you felt comfortable? I mean, how did it happen, and what were the challenges? I know some of it because Amber told me about it.
I mean, my biggest, like, I'll always remember this. We had like the big lecture halls, and then we had smaller sort of discussion groups. And I was in my media class, and it was like all South African students or like Zimbabwean. And the TUT leader, they're called TUTs, the discussion groups. The TUT leader was from New Jersey, but she had lived in South Africa for like the past 12 years. And we were talking about the ANC, and I literally raised my hand and I was like, wait, Nelson Mandela was a socialist? And that was sort of like the moment where they were like, you didn't know that like the ANC and most like radical African politics are inherently anti-capitalist? And I was like, no, I didn't learn that in America. I wonder why. But so that was sort of the point where I was like, I have to completely change how I'm thinking about everything right now. It's not just that I got the facts wrong. It's that my whole understanding of the way the world works is wrong, essentially, which was beautiful. It was amazing. But, yeah. Want to talk about the taxis?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that... Is this a taxi story? Okay. So I also was able to do research / an internship. So I was doing a case study on an NGO in Yaoundé, and it was called so the NGO, what they did was they were a national organization built from like a lot of different local organizations, which then work with community members. So it went from like top, bottom up. And I had this idea of what promoting change looked like. And advocating, and through my research with them and going into the office and like talking to all these like professionals, I was able to kind of shift my definition of what it is to promote change and what it is to be an advocate for people, or make sure, be an advocate. So that was where my own learning came from the most. It was letting go of that idealistic image I had of what change is and how that can be done, basically.
I think for me, it was like almost every day I was learning something new, like living a different experience and consistently being like, wow, why did I learn this any other way? But a big thing that like shaped my experience there was that there were only 12 of us on the program, and each one of us was from a different university, but 4 out of those 12 people were Black American students. And we all became really good friends. And so just like talking to them and speaking to them about their experiences like in Rwanda was something that really like affected me in the way I like shaped the world and like viewed the world, because for them this was like such a specific experience, and they had such specific like motivations for coming to the African continent, for coming to Rwanda, to kind of like connect to a place that they have been like so far removed and disconnected from. And like just learning about that was crazy to me that I had never thought about that, or even like understood, like been able to understand or talk to people about that. And so that was something that really contributed to my unlearning. And then probably also just like I'm originally Sri Lankan, and I somehow expected there to be more of like a similarity with Sri Lanka and Rwanda, and I kind of like, it's pretty bad, but I kind of told myself like, oh, if I can like live in Sri Lanka and go to Sri Lanka, I'll be fine in Rwanda, which I realized was a very wrong mentality to have. Not that I wasn't fine in Rwanda, I was completely fine, but that kind of like comparison of like, oh, if I can do one thing, like if I can live this way, then I'll be fine in Rwanda, which is like, that was just a very misconstrued perception that I had that I was consistently unlearning.
Yeah, I feel like kind of similar to that. It just kind of happened like every day, and I feel like it still is happening. Some of my favorite parts were definitely the people I met, and yeah, we went to a huge university, and some classes were 200 people, no one really spoke, and then some of them we would break into smaller groups and discuss different things, and those are always like my favorite times. And just because you got to hear just other people's experiences and about their lives, and it was people from South Africa, from other countries in Africa, and then some people from Europe, and there's just a wide range of people that I really enjoyed getting to know about. So.
I'm interested in what you said about education. I want to know more about the kind of education you get there. One of you said, I don't know if it's Joanna, or Joanna, yeah. But one of you said something like this. You said, well, basically, education is the same in terms of courses in that, but you said what was different? It was a different paradigm. Now, again, I need for my own education. I've talked to many people who have been to various countries in Africa, and so many of them said, well, you know, we saw the kind of Cambridge-Oxford system used. And I don't know, I'd like to know more about this. And that struck me as strange, yeah, in terms of colonialism and its impact, because, I mean, I've been around Cambridge University a lot, and Cambridge, a lot of the professors get a little annoyed when you talk about the evils of colonialism, because they really think they've done great things for Africa. You know? I mean that seriously. So I guess my question is, do you think that's true? That the model is the kind of Cambridge system or Oxford system? Is it, did you find any differences, significant differences in terms of the model? Or you said a different paradigm. What does that paradigm look like that's so different? Because you've talked about discussions, you've talked about seminars, right? You've talked about lectures. Sorry.
Well, in terms of the, like, we were at a huge university, so we were in larger class sizes. One of the differences was that the professors changed. So, like, the course would be the same, but it would be, like, 4 or 6 professors teaching it in small modules of different things that they focused on. What I meant by that, like, statement about the paradigm is just that, like, when I was taking notes for, like, my media class, that was about, like, global media, I found myself rewriting the same terms that I had been learning in my communication classes at Denison, but it was subverting the way that they were used into, like, how to understand that from the positionality of being in a country in the global south, and how these, like, systems of power operate, but how to understand that when you're the person that they're being operated against, kind of. So that's what I meant sort of by, like, a different paradigm. But overall, like, it was different from Denison. Like, I didn't talk to any of my professors. I was very afraid of them because the classes were so large and I would just, like, leave. But I do think that I, like, learned just as much, if not more, even though it was a totally different academic environment. I cried on the first day because I was so scared of how big the classes were, but then I got over it. But yeah, because I feel like it was worthwhile to, like, learn from that sort of different positionality. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, I think one thing that I definitely noticed on that topic was in my history class. I think we were looking at a lot of like colonial encounters in terms of, like, interactions between, you know, some of the first explorers to some cultures, and I think they definitely drew the line between, all right, here is kind of the pre-existing, you know, more Eurocentric sources that are traditionally looked at for these topics, and they kind of acknowledged that line of historical thought that has kind of come until this point, and then they made a huge effort to say, all right, here are these more localized sources from African authors and South African authors that we can use to help contextualize that, and really, like, acknowledging, all right, there's already been a lot of scholarship done to this point in these fields, but we're trying to take a new look at it and really make it a 50-50 type of comparison in terms of weighing all these different sources together.
Thanks.
I'm curious, like, in the different countries that you went to, did you experience seeing different perceptions about, like, America, or were there general perceptions of America or mentalities surrounding it, or was it not as, like, universal?
So one of the challenges for me was being identified as American, because I don't myself identify as American. I was born in the Dominican Republic. I was raised there. Like, I've never seen America as my home. But then when I got there, it it was a lot of, you're American, so you have money, you support Trump, which I was like, excuse me, you're like, I'm lighter skinned, so I used to wear my hair out, and they'd be like, oh, this white girl, and I'm just like, so it was like that idea of economic perception of America, political perception of America, and then race perception of America. So those three were like my challenges as I went through. So yeah, I just had to place myself into the context that I was in order to not get frustrated and not like shout at people, which I wasn't gonna shout at like a 50-year-old man, say like, no, I'm not white, like, you know, but like just think through like, why are they thinking like this, and or like, why is this their train of thought, and what can, like, how can I place myself into that mindset, not to justify it, but to understand it. Yeah.
One thing that I noticed was sort of, so South Africa had just impeached their president, President Zuma, for like massive corruption, and he also like sexually assaulted a young girl and things like that. So like whenever I would talk to South Africans, they would be like, oh, Trump's nothing. Like you like sort of decentering the narrative of like Trump's an anomaly and Trump is a uniquely American problem, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, along the same lines, I was like amazed by how involved everybody was in terms of their knowledge of American politics. I think it was a lot better than a lot of, you know, sometimes my peers here, which I thought was pretty amazing. So like, you know, people on the street would recognize that you were American many times and ask you questions about it, which I thought is something that was a huge cultural difference. You know, people are pretty guarded about their politics in the United States unless they're in the company of their friends or, you know, certain discussions. But I think having a more normalized culture about it was really interesting for me, and, you know, having a chance to talk about it all the time was a fun time too.
I think for me it was kind of the opposite, but also related to identity. So like I said, was with like in my program, like for Black American students, everyone else was white, and there was me. So we would go somewhere and they'd be like, oh yeah, that's like group of American students, and they would like literally look at me and be like, are you American? And I was like, it's complicated, but yeah, I guess. Like, so I was always just kind of having to explain, like, I'm from Sri Lanka, but I couldn't just say I'm from Sri Lanka, because if someone has asked me, like, I lived in Sri Lanka from 0 to 3 years old, so like could probably speak more about the US than I can about Sri Lanka. So it was like a very interesting situation to be put in, but kind of like Amber said, I was like always like that kind of interaction was so, like, I was never offended by that, because it was out of like curiosity and out of like, you know, like they probably don't meet a lot of Sri Lankans, so like they were just interested in me and like what I was doing, rather than like people being ignorant in the US. Like it was a very different experience, and I appreciated it.
Yeah, there were definitely like a lot of, you know, I think usually the first question was always about Trump and, you know, whether I supported him or not, and I was like, no. I was surprised a few times. Uber is like the main form of transportation, or a big form of transportation in Cape Town, so that's kind of what we use every day. And you know, if I would have conversations with the Uber driver, I had this happen a few times, that they actually, a few people like Trump. They think, they kind of see him as this like successful businessman, and he's done a great job, and he's wealthy and in power and things like that. So that was kind of interesting to kind of hear that they were actually like, oh, you know, I hope he wins again, kind of thing. It's like, okay, it's your opinion, but so yeah, that was kind of interesting. But for the most part, everyone's like, ooh.
Yeah, I really like the Amber's, I mean, you talked about race. I mean, it's complicated. When I go back to Cameroon, I'm the American, and then, yeah. So So the concept of race is different in that context. You know, you just become the other when you have lived abroad, which is obvious in the way you conduct yourself. But of course, the way you looked at when you are not from, even when I go to the market, they will say, why don't you give us some money that you brought? And I said, what let you know that I live here, even though I'm wearing a cabangondo the way you were dressed. So they know, there is a sense that they know when you are not local, when you haven't been living in the country, and then so the race in that sense is the other, I think, and not necessarily the color of their skin. And yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Any other questions? Final questions?
You didn't have many tests or quizzes, did you?
No. I had 0 tests and quizzes. Pardon? I didn't have any. We had like a final paper that we had to write. That's about it. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming and for giving us the experience to speak to you a little bit about our experiences. I think that personally for me, there aren't that many spaces to do that. And it is a very, like, as someone said, kind of isolating experience that is hard to, like, find a community to talk about here. So I think it was really nice for all of us and to, like, hear all of your insights and all of your questions. We really appreciated it.
Thank you.
You should, yeah, thank you.